Hi guys, Josh here. Welcome you to the first episode of Sparring Time.
Sparring time can bring your friends with sticks and blades and empty hands. Let's learn and have some fun. It's sparring time.
I'm joined by Shawn Zirger and Elrik Jundis to talk about what is sparring. Shawn, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shawn Zirger. Yeah, I've been doing martial arts for quite a while. You know, I started when I was quite young, and uh, I would say the sparring I did back then was more point sparring. So I really got my eyes opened later in my career with a gentleman named Makoto Kabiyama, and Makoto was my first JKD teacher. I'd say he was probably the most significant teacher in my history up until recently when I got to work with Mong Rami, but um, Romeo Macapagal. But Makoto was also a primo at the National Ballet. And uh, I mention this because when he taught us how to spar, when he taught us how to fight, he was basically a dramaturge, meaning he would get us into the character of the fight before he got us actually fighting. And so there was a lot of fighting in that environment. We were not uh, well equipped, so a lot of our fighting was without equipment, sometimes wearing steel-toed boots, some just because that's what we were wearing at the time. And like our early grappling was on carpets, so it's that was our protective equipment. And then I guess my next major um, uh, foray into sparring was when I opened up the Toronto Throwdown group, based out of the Bullshido group online, which was basically getting people together who were talking too much on the internet and getting them together to actually like fight. And that was a crazy experience because at first we had no parameters and people would just fight. And usually like just on an open floor, sometimes three or four fights going on at the same time, and with no real um, contract as to how that fight was going to go down. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I got involved in the Dog Brothers, and that's pretty much as close as you get to full on fighting without it being a real fight. Um, and I say not a real fight because you're not being ambushed. Um, uh, and then, of course, there's all the things that you do to prepare for those kinds of things. So, but that's my short introduction to sparring.
All right, thank you, Shawn. Let's have Elrik give a quick introduction.
So my martial arts started in high school with high school fencing, and then let's see, right before college I was doing Korean martial arts, and I thought I was going to continue with that until at the community college I was going to had an excellent judo program and boxing program, and then I realized, using today's language, I was at a McDojo and no one was learning how to fight. And I was actually learning how to box and do judo in an applied sense in both those settings. And I also quickly learned back then, it's like, you know what? I don't like punching combat sports because getting hit in the head and stomach sucked. I didn't like it, but I loved the judo. And interesting, around the same time, I started doing Filipino martial arts. There's an interesting thing. It was a time, at least in California, where, like, at least in the communities I was in, the people I was on, they looked really down on sparring. And they were like, it's too dangerous if you're really going to do it. And like, there are people like, when people tried it, they would hurt people. Like, they would break their hands with sticks and stuff. But there was also people who were doing the sports. And now here's the funny thing. I was teaching 91 on a college campus. and a lot of my students were like, they were doing other sports, so they wanted to push it. So we'd be doing like flow drills, and then all of a sudden someone would grab someone, or go down to the ground and go to grappling. But we controlled, we titrated if any punching that was happening, any elbows, knees. And then because I was doing a medial corto system, all the stick stuff was blocks, and then we were controlling the hits. It was like part of the way that art was done. And it wasn't till, reading all the stuff online. And then also, like, I was part of the generation where people did do the studio, what do you call it? What do you call it? Studio storming. Like on actually on 4 different occasions. Actually, at this time, I think I will name them. Twice for Mike and I, students from there came to challenge us at our school. Another school I won't name, but another one is like I was talking a lot of smack, and a van load of Edward students came to challenge, and that one unfortunately didn't happen because anyway, I'll leave that alone. But that was the time. But I knew from judo, and then also when I actually did stick, I played with friends who were fencers. That going against a collegiate guy, like they could touch me at will, like an epee guy. I was like shocked at how well his measure was, his timing and everything was. I think I'm going off a little bit, but because of the Dog Brothers, I saw it. I had to do that. There were some fight clubs in the Bay. I got hurt stuff in some of those things that made me also think about like, oh, how do you train and do this safely? Because I was messed up like after one FMA sparring altercation. I was messed up for 8 months. But then and then it's like, since that's 20 years ago, it's just like, okay, how can you enjoy and have fun with sparring and play with different gear and play with different groups, and then go back and forth between, like, okay, there's the traditional systems, now the commercial systems and all the different flows. But if you can't do like judo and boxing and actually play with it, because in my opinion, unless you're sparring, you're not going to get the timing and the skill that the old guys had. Like in the 90s, I got to meet a number of the old men and train with them, and I was like, their skill compared to mine is someone in my late 20s, and these guys in their 60s, 70s, up to their 90s. It was night and day difference. And if this generation doesn't spar, they're not going to get anywhere near that. Now, sparring different, I think that's what today's conversation is going to be about. But I believe you have to spar. It's not the only thing you should do, but like there's bad habits in terms of sparring. But I think we'll get into that. I'll shut up now.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Elric. And yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of stories about the dojo storming and those backyard sparring sessions and whatnot. I'm sure we'll pick that up in a different video as well. All right, let's head into our first question for the day. What is sparring? Like, what is it? Like, why do we do it? Is it important? Is it necessary? Do we need to spar? Or like, does everyone need to spar? Is there an age limit? There's so many questions around sparring, but I just want to get down to, in your guys' point of view, what is sparring? All right, we'll start off with Shawn.
Ah, um, what is sparring? So sparring is a safe way to practice your fight skills, and I say it's safe, but it's safer than actually fighting. So the whole thing about sparring is how do we access all of the attributes that we need to access without damaging ourselves so much that we lose our training partners or that we lose our ability to continue training. And that's really the difference between sparring and fighting. Is sparring has conventions that are inserted into it that are going to prevent injury. And unfortunately, that actually leads to a bunch of misunderstandings about what we're actually doing if you let it. And so you have to be really careful when you're setting up the terms for sparring, that you're very clear on a couple of points. In the throwdown group that I've been running since 2006, where we get together every other month to basically to fight, and to fight people that we don't know, to fight people from systems that we haven't met before. It creates a really great environment, because the very first thing we do is we set the context for how do you arrange your sparring. And because, again, I was talking the early days of the throwdown, we didn't have any rules. We were just like, you want to fight? Okay, let's go. And people got hurt. It was crazy. It was intense, and people were coming to cut their teeth. People were coming to see, like, hey, can I beat everybody? Am I as good as I think I am, or proving I'm as good as I think I am? And what we found out was that there were lots of schools out there that were producing good fighters, and there was lots of schools out there that were producing people who couldn't transition between what they'd been training and what was happening live. But it was dangerous. Later, we started setting the context more clearly, and that's something that I picked up from Mark Denny when I went to do the Dog Brothers fights, because at the beginning of those fights, they set context, and the context is for fighting and for how you're going to behave before and after and during the fights. And so we did the same thing at the throwdown with the sparring. So the major things that you have to set in terms of context is, what type of fight are we going to do? So for instance, if someone thinks like the fight is a boxing match, then they're thinking all hands, and they're not thinking about clinch. They're not thinking about kicks. They're not. So if someone says, let's do MMA, and the other person's going like, well, we have takedowns in our Sanda art, but they're not prepared for what happens after they hit the ground, then it's not a clear matchup. So you got to be really, really clear on what's in and what's not in on the fights. For instance, at my events, if someone says we're going to stick fight or we're going to sword fight, I assume that means punching, kicking, kneeing, grappling are all in, unless they say otherwise. And this just maintains clarity, so that people realize, like, if they didn't want to be doing takedowns, they have to say so. If they, if they don't want to wrestle on the ground after the takedown, they have to say so. And this just stops it from escalating too much. The other thing is intensity. Like, how hard are you going to go, and how are you going to define that intensity? So we used to have light, medium, and hard fights, and that was a mistake, because there's no such thing as a medium fight, right? Medium means we're going to start light and then escalate. and that's all it means, right? So there's either a light fight where you're trying to like touch the target and not hurt the person, and then there's a hard fight where you're just swinging normally, and then there's full contact, which is different than a hard fight, because for us, a hard fight means we're going to swing normally, and if I notice that you're no longer able to defend yourself, I will give you quarter while defending myself and check in to make sure you're okay and that you want to continue or don't want to continue. In a full contact bout, I'm going to submit you or knock you out. And that's the distinction, right? And so whether or not you get quarter is the difference between hard and full contact. But you can't do full contact fights without having a medic around, because that's gonna That's going to lead to serious injuries. So the other thing that you need to define is the time frame. If you don't have people who have been putting the time in to get fight level cardio going, I wouldn't recommend doing more than a 2-minute bout, because that's when fatigue oriented injuries happen. And I'd say those are kind of the most important things. If you're going to spar, you need to be really, really clear on what you're sparring and what the intensity is going to be, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other sub classifications you can get into after that, but I think those are the two major factors.
All right, thank you, Shawn. Right before I move on to Elrik, can you just say one more time your definition for sparring, just to make sure everyone got it? Just can we sum it up and like the thing you said in the beginning, like what is sparring to you? What's your definition?
That me or
Yeah,
Elric?
Shawn, that's you. That's you. Right
Oh,
before
me.
you give it to Elric,
So,
we'll just sum it up.
sparring is um, making fighting safe through setting parameters.
All right, you guys heard it here from Shawn. Keeping your training partner or spar mate, whatever you want to call them, safe. Well, in my opinion, I'd still try to get something out of it, meaning try to learn something from the spar, and yeah, making sure it's a good environment. So we'll get more. We'll
Absolutely.
talk more about that in a bit. For now, let's head to Elric, and we'll hear his definition of sparring.
And I like what Shawn says because my definition is different, but the assumption of safety is inside of it. It's not said, but and so my definition is it's uh, you know it's there's an agreement on you have two people, you're going to try to apply your techniques and you're going to try to make their techniques not work. And the unsaid is or the explicit side of it, I guess should be said now, is like and done safely. Like one of the first things, so that's my definition of sparring. You know, not non-compliant play is the best way to describe it. Not or horseplay, because in horseplay it's assumed that hey, this is going to be fun, and then you're going to, um, but you're not going to injure each other. And I like to borrow the idea from like judo or other martial arts where they talk about randori, which is like randori is non-compliant, and this is what you do in your class. Like every class, maybe half the class is randori. You got two guys trying to throw each other. But the difference between randori or newaza when you're doing it on the ground, like BJJ, and shiai, a tournament, like the intensity level is like typically randori should be like 70% or lower, in my opinion. I'm saying this as a much older person. When I was young doing it, I went balls to the walls every time. But you know what? My experiences doing tournaments, it was more intense. Um, but I also want to tap onto like what Shawn was talking about. Like, I like that. There is no such thing as medium. It's really light controlled, hard, and I like the full contact. And the other things, like for me, full contact should be rattan, and it should be yeah, like you're gonna need a month or longer to heal from that because injuries happen in that environment. I don't think I mean, if you're doing sparring with rattan, I mean, actually at this point, I'm like, why spar with rattan? Uh, at least, I mean, there's time to do it, but it's like you got padded sticks. There's a lot of other types of sparring you can do that's more technical, light, and you don't get injuries. But I guess we can get into that more later. Just taking a look at my notes. I think one of the things that needs to be understood is that we're 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 coming from a weapons-based concept, and if you're learning how to use a weapon well, you can injure people. You've trained yourself. I mean, there's times where I don't put myself in the mode, but it's like I put myself in the mode. It's like I've developed the power that if I get the timing right, even if it's a padded stick and I hit someone in the hand, I might actually break hand bones, or I can break something in the face. Or there's people who train to injure people. It's like when you train like that, you shouldn't be bringing that type of intention and skill into it. It's like a good person with their elbows, they could, hurt someone's rib cage and stuff. But going into like, it's different when you have everybody who is like they're at the same level of fitness. But when you're doing gatherings like what you do, Joseph, or what Sean's talking about, you're going to have people who are training like they're combat athletes, or like they're training like for real in their mind for something. People who train like that need to like really bring they need to know how dangerous they are, because otherwise when like someone who trains Muay Thai kicks someone who's never trained, that other person might be like, they're not be able, they can break bones and stuff. I was gonna say one of the other areas like injuries happen is, oh, hey, I can do throws, I can land, and then they don't realize the other person was a collegiate, I mean not a collegiate, or maybe even just a high school champion, or maybe they're from New York or Michigan. If they grab a regular person, even if they're like, oh, I did judo, I'm still doing like college judo as a beginner, that state champion guy, one throw, they can actually dislocate the other guy's shoulder. They can, put them in the hospital. I've seen that happen more than once. So you got to really know what's safe and what's not safe, and then have the community that keeps each other safe. Because I've also seen it get out of hand sometimes. But like what he said, Mark Denny, and then like I think anyone who does a good event, you do have to set that context, and then if you have a good community once it forms, it's like at your gatherings, Joseph, it's really the community that needs to hold space. So you personally come in, and then other people tell them, hey, whoa, 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 they break it down. Or example of what I've done with other communities is like, oh no, you don't have to stop them. They want to hit that hard, they do want to go to the ground. So that's the flip side of it, is like, if people can safely go to the ground on cement, some people can, and then you don't have the other people freaking out. So community, communication, context, that all goes into creating good community gatherings. But then, like, if you're just a teacher for a small group, how do you get your own group to grow and intensify? I think that's all what makes sparring beneficial.
What gets really tricky here is that everyone has different definition for sparring and safety as well. And you mentioned, non-compliant, right? There's levels to that too. Like, how much do I resist? How much do I comply to a technique, but it still be keeping the context of being safe, right? So there's so much questions still about that need to be defined before sparring. Yeah, that's great. Really communicating, right? Different events. There's different types of people, right? Both of you guys mentioned. So yeah, let's move on to like, why do we need to spar, right? Both of you gave your definitions on what sparring is. So let's get into why do we need to do it? Because we're just doing it for fun. We're doing it to learn something. Like, what's the reason behind it? Let's start off with Shawn.
Um, if you develop the skills for something and then you do not do the thing, um, those skills will never be realized. So it doesn't. That's universal. You could develop carpentry skills, but if you don't actually try to build cabinetry, like you'll never do a good joint. And it's, or any other example. So sparring is absolutely essential for us to develop our fight skills. And but then so is fighting. So because sparring doesn't really get you there. It paves the way for you to do better in a real fight. It sets you up to go back to your training with clearer objectives and better understanding of what it is that you need to work on to be able to actually execute on the principles that you've been practicing. Um, because if you don't spar, and I've seen it so many times where people will show up to a sparring event and they're like, well, I've been training in this thing, and then you see them actually fight, and they're like sitting there going, whoa, what happened? At an event like the Throwdown, I'm going to keep referring to it because I've been doing it for so long and so regularly. But in an event like that, all of us will look at that person and be like, yeah, I remember when we got here and had that experience. And so it's never like oh, we're laughing at them. It's like, no, we're laughing along with them, because you get into the unknown and you have all of these beliefs from your training. And of course, all of us do this in our martial arts training, because we'll hold our teacher on a pedestal and we'll hold our system on a pedestal, and we'll be like, yeah, we're training this and it's from this famous person, and I've seen my teacher, they're awesome. And you have all of these illusions that get dispersed in that first sparring match, because you you bring those to the match, and then the difference between what you imagined it was and what it really is becomes clarified through failure. And you need that failure to be able to go, oh, okay, I thought I understood, and you did to a degree. And now you have to go back to your training and go, well, how do I make myself do that? This is one of the things that I'm loving about the education I got from Romeo Macapagal. Is Makoto introduced me to fighting, and he introduced me very, very well. He's a fighter, and he's also a very strong intellect, and he's able to put you in the right frame of mind and put you in the right context before you get there, even if you're just doing limited sparring, let's call it. But Romeo Macapagal, it's like, this is combat, and he's demands that you're perfect in many, many ways. And what I find now is, it's like, well, can I make myself behave in the ideal of the system? And of course the answer is like, well, I'm still reaching. Because I mean, you just don't get there immediately, despite that's what everybody wants from you. Myself, the teachers, my peers, everybody wants to be the ideal of the system, but you have to convince yourself to be the ideal of the system. Without sparring, you don't get to see where you're really at versus your assumptions and your beliefs and your actual ability. You need the sparring to create the failure so that you can go back to the drawing board and rework the problem.
All right. Thank you, Shawn. Yeah, that was great. Trial and error. You can learn a lot there, right? If you make a mistake, you can learn from it. Or if you do pull off the move you're trying to work on, you can still have to figure out why it worked, right? It's not just the mistakes you look at. You got to look at the stuff that works too. Does it work because, because my opponent's less experienced? Does it work because I get longer reach? Or is it the weapon? So there's so many aspects to trial and error, right? So yeah, that was really great insight, Shawn. Thank you. And let's hand it over to Elrik. Why do we need to spar? Why is it important? Is it necessary? Let's hand it over to Elrik.
I would say, I mean, I think Shawn nailed a lot of it very well. And it's also that there is, when I look back on some of the masters, there's a depth to the techniques that it's like you see people, it's like, oh, cool. They're doing some kind of disarm. People have been working on it for 5 years, but then it's like people have put in the time. It's like, man, every time you touch hands with, say, Yuli Romo or Jamie Kuzan, these two guys who are alive right now, their disarms is like, it just came out like butter. Grandmaster Sinisa, Eduardo Sinisa in Cebu is another example of that. But I'll bring it back also to judo. It's like, when you're learning, it's just like, oh, here's the basic throw. Now you're working with another guy. But I've I've touched hands with people who are on the U.S. national team, and it's like at touch. Like as soon as they grab, you're screwed. They grab you, you're off balance, and you're flying all in the same beat. And like I've done that where I'm like left forward, right back, just left middle. I'm telling them exactly where to go. I know how to reverse and stop that usually because these people have put so much time in going deep with technique. It's way, way, way deeper. And Shawn and I, it's just like kind of funny. It's like, wow, we're good. I'm also a student of Romy Macapagal. And it's like when two steel blades connect, it's not just about, oh, knocking it out of the way. It's like, oh, there's this thing about, oh, you can actually dominate and control them in the bind. That's like the grip and throwing someone off balance. It's like you have to fail, and that only comes out of sparring where that comes out. I'm just gonna jump back. I really like how Shawn said sparring is not fighting. 100% agree about that because said it. Sparring is supposed to keep people safe, but you want to get as close to it as you can. But it's like there are certain things that I believe if you really develop a deep skill, you like that skill to throw someone hard. The entire last 20 years of me doing FMA sparring, when it goes to throwing, in 20 years, I have never used a throw that goes above my waist, and I've never used a high amplitude throw, even though that's all I focused on as a judoka. Why? Because 99% of FMA people don't train to do that safely, so I can't use it if I want to keep people safe. Um, and I think there's certain techniques like that. So it's like, what do you include? What do you don't include? Um, and I think, like, it's kind of pointing to is like sparring should be the spectrum of light to hard full contact, like he was saying, but it's like there's a spectrum of like how are you going to get to this technique? Like there's techniques, it's like, okay, my timing is good when I'm fighting with people from maybe these styles, but if they're doing some power swings like that, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, what do you need to do to really own that technique? Because when you really own the technique, it's like the setups, the reversals, that kind of real world understanding of techniques only comes out from sparring. You can't develop that out of solo drills. And here's the other thing that I also want to get into is like I train now at this point in my life from I call it classical FMA. So I'm trying to preserve and understand the stuff of the last generation that fought with this stuff. And for them, they wanted to end the fight. But how did that? A lot of them thought the compo, 3 hits, it's over. Illustrissimo, 3 to 5 hits, it's over. So if we're just doing 1 hit, well, we're not dominating with 3 hits and uncontested. How often do we see in any sparring where one guy is actually hitting the guy 3 times, 5 times, uncontested? That's the old skills. Like there's a spectrum that we can get to, and we're only going to get to those higher levels, in my opinion, by sparring. There's no other way to do it.
All right, thank you for that, Elric. Yeah, you mentioned about planning certain number of hits, right? I think that also depends on range you prefer fighting at. So that's a big, big difference, right? But some systems and some guys who like to spar, they prefer closer up or medium to close range. You can definitely land your combinations, but again, it's not easy to do that safely, right? And not getting hit, right? But do you dominate it by landing more hits, or when do you counter? Do you block? So there's a lot that goes into that. So yeah, but both of you mentioned the difference between a bit with sparring and fighting, right? So we'll get a bit into that right now. So what is the difference between sparring, fighting, or doing drills, right? And then or sparring drills, specifically sparring. Specifically doing drills for sparring, or doing drills for fighting, or just drills for Filipino martial arts, weapon fighting, or non-weapon fighting. Like, what's the difference? Like, if I'm holding up mitts, how does that translate to sparring? Right, stuff like that. So let's pass it over to Shawn and get his thoughts on it.
Um, So this really comes down to a person's understanding of fighting. And yes, you need to make a distinction because drills are not sparring because they're cooperative. Drills drills are sequences of events. Um, they're and this is something that my point of view has changed on a lot over the years because I came from an environment where we thought drills were a big improvement over the old school way, right? So our early JKD days with Vunak and with um, Larry Hartzell and of course Dan Inosanto, but mostly Vunak and Hartzell for us at the beginning. Drills were the way that you got the big picture, and we sparred a lot and we sparred hard. So the drills for us were okay. We got the big picture. Now we'll throw ourselves into the random of a sparring match and see what comes out. And so it was kind of trial and error, and um, it worked. Like we got good quickly, as compared to the people that were doing, say, traditional karate, taekwondo, um, at that time in the 90s in our area. But I think looking back on it, it's because at that time in our area, the people that were doing those traditional um, arts with kata, with defined rigid movements, were only doing those defined rigid movements and weren't actually also sparring in an open format. They were maybe doing 1-step, 2-step, 3-step sparring, which are essentially drills, designed to create reaction speed and so on, but they weren't as dynamic as an open spar where it's like the person can do all of their techniques. But we had the benefit of having teachers who were very combative. Makoto was very combative. He was not only was he prone to getting in street fights, but he was doing security for punk bands at the time, who tended to clash at the time with skinheads because like the 80s and 90s were fun. And so, and then there's Paul Vunak, who was Paul Vunak, and had a tendency to get into bar fights. And then there was Larry Hartzell, who didn't get enough of Vietnam the first time and went back for seconds. So these were all guys who did fight and were able to teach us drills and so on and get us fighting. But more recently, again, looking to my largely Romeo Macapagal, who really dislikes drills due to their cooperative nature. I can see that if you're doing technique versus a clear set of emergent requirements, and it's like that technique and you perfect that technique, that's hugely valuable in a fight where the milliseconds and the individual degrees of angle make all the difference. And I find myself spending almost no time at all with my old drills to give people the big picture. And I find myself focusing a lot more on the technique and the timing and sparring. So here's my point, though. Someone in all of that has to understand fighting in order to make to convert technique into combative ability. So drills really, really useful for getting to see the picture. I now look at drills as being a way to get people to see the probabilities in a fight. From this moment, this is probable. From this moment, this is probable, because of where you are in time and space in the orbits of what is likely to happen. It's useful for that. In terms of how useful they are for an actual full-on intensive engagement, that millisecond where the clash is happening, I'm feeling it's less and less useful there. And the focus on that technique and the sparring is a little bit more important. I think where it falls down is where you don't have an awareness of the realities of the outcomes of a fight, and you let your sparring become play. And it's funny, I went to an event recently, and it was a very playful event, and it was a lot of people using soft stick or even rattan, but playfully. And I got into it and I played and I had a great time. And then the next day I thought about my performance and I was so upset. I was like, wow, I played. And I think part of it's Monrami's voice here on my shoulder, like saying like, wow, like, why didn't you just destroy everybody? And I was like, yeah, I was playful. And some people even posted their videos on that. So people got to see me doing that, but I couldn't switch back. And I did a fight where I was supposed to have switched back and I didn't switch back. So this is the thing. It's like, well, is it going to be okay to trade? Not in a real fight. And like I don't go to Dog Brothers and be okay about trading. And so a lot of times I'll come out of a Dog Brothers match unscathed because I'm looking at not getting hit at all. And that's not always possible, but the last time I went, it was quite possible. It happened. I came out with like 3 grazes on me as opposed to like the big black welts. But at that event where we were being playful, I came out with like a big bruise down the inside of my thigh, and it was so it's an interesting thing because I've seen a lot of times where it's like it's okay to just come in and trade, clash. It's like it's super fun, but I wouldn't want to actually be in that fight. So this is I think these are the things that you have to mitigate. I've been in a lot of real fights because of my a third of my career has been security work and doing frontline security work, and of course it's never okay to trade when it's a real fight. You want to set things up in such a way as even if they launch first, you're going to be in a dominant position, and that's the only way to do it. And so, if you're going to have sparring and you want it to be leading to real skill, someone has to be calling you out on whether or not that was combatively viable, right? So that's my take on the difference between these things.
All right. Thank you, Shawn. Yeah, the context between being playful and, being serious about it, or even just trying to dominate someone, that's, yeah, just the context there. Like when you set the tone for an event or like a match or the day, even, it's sometimes difficult to switch back, or, yeah, it really depends who you're sparring with as well and stuff like that. Yeah, that's great. Great
Yeah.
insight from Shawn there. And yeah,
If I could just add one thing.
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. There was a time where I reported back about a spar that I did with some of my friends, and I had complimented them because they did well against me while I was teaching them a new thing I was training. But I put that back to my teacher. My teacher was so disappointed in me. He's like, no, you must dominate. And I'm like, okay. So I went back, and ever after, whenever I spar with these guys doing that art, I do my very, very best to dominate. All of those guys prefer it. Right? It's not because we're being mean or nasty to each other. It's because when they know that I'm trying to like destroy them, then they know that their skills are ramping up. And it's like, if I let it be playful, they know that it's, 50% like they're doing well and 50% I did something stupid. It just doesn't have the same impact, right? So yeah, it was an interesting lesson for me. Anyway, that's the thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, so yeah, Elric also mentioned about dominating, like adding those like trying to hit them multiple times, doing the combinations and not like finishing the fight essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's still the thing we talked about a while ago was still in the context of sparring is trying to keep them safe, right? Dominating and still keeping them safe. That becomes a bit tricky as well. That will really depend on the rules, who's there, if there's a referee, medic on site, and a bunch of other details. So, yeah, that's another rabbit hole we can go down maybe later on. So, yeah, for now, let's hand it to Elric. What's your take on the difference between doing drills, sparring, and fighting, right? Or like sparring drills, mid work, or just you mentioned you have a background in judo as well, so it doesn't
Well,
have to be
I
weapon
even go to
fighting.
the extreme. It's like around the time I started to really get into sparring with FMA, I also went down Chinese internal martial arts rabbit hole. So doing Tai Chi forms, I mean, hundreds of moves and some of these things that I've trained in several different of those systems. And it's like the and for me on one level, it's like it's comparable to drills and that like there's a lot of content. But if you're not gonna also isolate things, like okay, one technique, how do we get it right? So at the moment of like rattan hitting rattan or steel hitting steel, like how do we really make this work? And how do we, if it's supposed to dominate, how do we dominate that other person? If you don't understand that in the follow-up and can do it in real time, can do it in the right measure, and can actually dominate someone who's doesn't want you to do it to them, it's like how well do you understand that? You could be doing all these forms and like these people can't fight with any of it. I see I'm almost thinking like Krav Maga because I have friends who've done that. And it's like, they learn a sequence, they learn a drill so that they the sequence, and it's like, they're like a wind-up toy in the right scenario, boom, and they go. Brrr. For someone who's new, who only has a limited amount of time, who doesn't want to spar, hey, at least you're getting something. And if like they get grabbed, it gives them something, and it gives them an understanding of whatever area they're working on that thing. But there is a big difference between like, okay, fighting, self-defense, and then other people want to use it. But I kind of think of it as tactical application. The way you're going to apply your skills, like if you're, like I had several students who did loss prevention in San Francisco. It's like that's when security guards in a department store could actually grab people and say, no, you can't leave. Now they just let them do that in California, right? But I was at, you people were cops, you people who worked in prisons, and then like I've met people who've used it in actual combat, and it's like how you do it in each setting is totally different. How you think of self-defense in like, oh, if you like maybe you live in a gated village in Manila and you're like from a certain social class, what you do for self-defense should not be at all like what someone does for self-defense if say they live in Tondo or like, a city like Portland where the cops, where there's just like wild areas in those areas. So you need to use your sparring as a particular phase to prepare you for whatever environments, whatever you're going towards. And you need to know how to deconstruct, like Shawn was alluding to, 1.2, one step, two step, three step sparring. but there's variations of that of like, okay, we're just going to work off of like, okay, these two attacks, we're going to enter in like at Largo range, and we're going to go into the clinch. You need to know how to deconstruct all of your method to develop those skills. But sparring can be just free flowing, but you should also be able to get that idea, that feel of sparring, and taking it into those types of things. There's a lot of different mindsets of like, oh, are we just developing? Like I agree with Shawn. Like there's sparring that's just play, but it can also be like, oh no, we're really focused on something, and then inside of it, it's like, oh, you're gonna make a lot of mistakes, but inside of making those mistakes, then you're actually learning the timing to go in there so you can engage your weapon safely and counter it, and then get your hit in. And you got to take the hits that are going to come along with it. And like, I don't, when I go to these gatherings, I'm just playing, but it's like sometimes I'm really intentionally like, okay, I want to work on this skill today or that skill today, and I'm bringing it into the fight. If you're really understand your art and you know what you're developing, you just bring that into your sparring sessions, and it's like, okay, this is what I'm working on. And when I taught, I used to say, okay, when you guys spar, what I want you to talk about is like, what are you working on? I used to break people into groups of three. Okay, so two people sparring, one person observing, and they all knew like, oh, this person was working on this, that person was working on that. Maybe these two who are sparring won't tell each other, but this guy knew so that they could actually give feedback. And if you had a larger group watching, you might have 5 people watching and they get feedback from 5 people. But that way you have an engaged audience and also you have engaged fighters. And then like now, whenever time you're breaking into these smaller groups of fighting, more people are getting benefit out of it. So I think for me, it's like, man, if you're going to spar, make it intelligent, get value out of it. And I'm seeing like, what else did uh, I think like this idea of different levels of intensity, different levels of like your techniques. You got to know how to constrain or expand what those non-compliant engagements are going to be to bring out the skills you want to bring out. And I've been around, so I know what to bring out of myself. But it's like people are teaching. It's like, oh, how do you bring that out of, your students, or empower your students to actually start to empower each other? Is what I'm kind of pointing towards.
All right, thank you for that, Elric. That's yeah, context matter, like you mentioned throughout the entire call today. Context is
I do
Elric.
want to say one last thing to what Shawn also pointed to. It's like you'll have phases of your growth, and it's like sometimes you need to play, sometimes you need to focus on just like your entries, or sometimes you need to focus on like, okay, I just need to be able to do all my engagements right. I don't take any hits. So there's a spectrum of how you're going to train if you've been doing it for a while. And when you're new, if you're new, I'd say go find people who've been sparring a while and learn from them, mentor under them is actually what I would say. Because there's so much to it that different people have different ways to do it, but there's like a lot to sparring. It can look like two people are just, oh, it's I hate when people say, oh, it's all the same, everybody's doing the same thing. It's like, no, there isn't. And it's always interesting to me to see what people see when they see sparring matches. But because I've looked at it from like 20 years of different martial arts, actually, if I go back to my judo, 30 years of different types of martial arts sparring, there's so much progression that you can do. And there's usually a lot more going on than people realize, in my opinion. Sometimes it's surface level, but people are experienced, like they're doing more than you can see.
All right. Yeah, setting goals, finding mentors. Yeah, that definitely help with your progress for sparring, drills, or fighting. Yeah, like Shawn and mentioned, one of his first instructors was combative. Yeah, that makes a big difference on how you set goals and how you view fighting, sparring, and doing drills. And for Elric, yeah, the mentors. I know you had a lot of instructors, and you experienced a lot of different fighting systems, not only weapon based ones, also empty hand. I'm sure that wealth of knowledge would definitely come in handy. And yeah, I've seen you a lot of times in the events I host, like a lot of people approaching you and you're showing them some stuff. So yeah, that's it's great when you pass down something because you also learn as well as you mentor someone.
Sparring time can bring your friends with sticks and blades and empty hands. Let's learn and have some fun. It's sparring time.